little less crowd than we had last time, so it's kind of nice to see that there's still quite a bit of interest in our project that we're working on. So first, so everybody knows, I think most people know, at least our committee knows, that Bradford Digest along with the village. I'd like to introduce Tim Dodge. Tim, you want to say something about yourself to the tech?
Sure, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tim Dodge. I'm the new Community Development Director and recovering city manager. That's what I told everybody. I was actually a city manager for 14 years, and prior to that, I actually came up through the community development ranks. And I served in Las Vegas and Santa Rosa. And I'm happy to be here in your community. It's a beautiful community.
Thank you. Well, welcome. We're glad to have you, Tim. So,
Thank you.
so we have the agenda. Do I have a motion to accept the agenda?
Make a motion to accept it.
Second. Any opposition? Seeing none, then the agenda will be accepted. So, the minutes, I think because of the transition with between Bradford and Tim, we don't have minutes from last meeting.
He said he did them, we get them.
But we'll find them, so we'll take action on those at a later time. So we're going to defer action on the minutes as they currently stand. So, new business. So as we talked about last time, we, as a committee, deferred action on the making a recommendation to the village until January. At that time, we had suggested that, or asked that if there were some suggestions for alternative sites to come forward. So we have some of those. We've asked Eastern Housing Authority to come and also give us a presentation, kind of talk about some of the sites and what some of the criteria will be for us to, that we'll need to take into consideration from that standpoint. So we'll do that. But you have on your agenda the where they be village-owned properties, or they are several that have been suggested from various citizens in the community for sites from that standpoint. I think right now, Chris, if it's okay if I turn it over to you and you can kind of
Sure.
go over that, I think that'd be great. So.
In regards to the issues of site selection, which talks about site control, because the village-owned properties are from a governmental entity, and privately owned property is from a citizen, your site control issues are different. There are going to be different issues. Different contracts have to be established for site control as you move forward with the development. One of the things to consider here is that just as a precursor to all this, site control, as per the housing or the tax credit program, requires you to have a complete use of that property through the July of that year's offering. In other words, if we go in 2020 in January, then you have to have, site control has to be maintained at least through July, meaning through the award period for that. So in other words, you can't have a restriction that says, if we get a better offer, we're going to sell it to somebody else. You have to have complete site control of that property up until that point. You can have, the sale can be contingent on something, but there can't be contingencies which would take it out of the tax credit program before July of that year. But with that being said, the issues with the village-owned property are part of that is a village-owned property that brings what they call leverage. It used to be called local contribution, but that helps with the points in an application that any developer is doing for a project. So that's one aspect to consider as you look at village-owned properties. For the non-village-owned properties, the privately owned properties, then you would have to have a purchase agreement, which was pretty ironclad for those properties leading up to that. Now, that deals with the issue of the local contribution, because if you go with private property, then local contribution points would have to come from another contribution from the city or from a municipality to make up for that. But part of what the conversation was in regards to how a project scores the property and how it scores. Each of those are different because again, where is it in a main street area? Is it close to services? Is it close to transportation? All of those have aspects. All of those have an effect on how a project will score. And when we talk about scoring, there's a number of criteria in the tax credit program, and if you score well enough to be competitive, then you're going to want to move forward with that. If a project doesn't score well enough, then most developers are not going to take that on because it's a lot of effort, a lot of energy, and a lot of money to go forward with that. And if it isn't going to be competitive, they're not going to move forward. They're not. Nobody's going to be interested in doing that. So what I might tell you is that Caesar can talk a little bit more about the criteria themselves and what makes a difference and how you move forward with that. But what I would say is that you probably want to whittle down your list quite a bit to make sure that you're dealing with maybe at most 3 properties so that you can do a scoring on each one, so that a pre-scoring can be done to see if they're going to even be competitive. So.
You mean, are you saying doing a scoring on, if we would look at the properties that are on here, score each one now to see how we think it would score?
Yeah, because you
Or to pick 2 to 3 properties that, just from the scoring criteria that you think it might, and then do a complete scoring
Scoring on
assessment.
it, yeah.
So,
Is that what you're saying?
let's make sure I understand what you're on the site control that you were talking about. So assuming that we identify 2 or 3 pieces of property before, let's say, in November.
okay.
And some of those being some of these that are not owned by the village, okay?
Okay.
What kind of time frame are we looking at? Because I guess I didn't understand how you were describing that and stuff. So what kind of time frame, or how do we meet the need that the grant to, if we were to pick a property that's not owned by the village? So
Because of the fact that you're looking at you're going to be doing your application in essentially 2020. Okay, so during the next, I would say you want to have some clarity as to where you want to go, probably by the middle of next year. I just don't you think, Caesar, by
Right, so, okay, well, this is a competitive process. So if a site or a project is not competitive, we're wasting everybody's time. So there's a 20-point criteria that the Mortgage Finance Authority has. And so when we're looking at projects, we go through this long list and see if we score. And what we do is we'll look at the current year to see where the awarded projects, where the awards were. So for example, if for new construction, the award points were between, or say 170 points up, we have to have an application that scores above 170 because we know, hey, that's where the awards were. So as far as site control, we have time, right? So if there's 2 or 3 sites, and of course, this is real estate development. So hopefully these sites have infrastructure. They have sewer, water, electrical, the stuff that we don't have to bring in because there's a cost behind that, right? So we have that. It's close into town because we need that for scoring purposes. I mean, these properties need to be close to services, to markets, to retail, to all of this type of stuff. It helps us if we are near a main street area or redevelopment area. So we look at all these different things. But as far as site control, yes, we can look at different options, score these properties based on the criteria that is in place right now. It may change a little bit, but it shouldn't really, because the State Housing Agency, they have a public comment period every August, September of every year. So sometimes they make changes based on that public comment. But it should be very little because the criteria that's there is supposed to be for 2018 and 2019. So they shouldn't really make a lot of changes. And so we score these sites, we see which is competitive or not competitive. And then if there's two or one is competitive or there's more, then we make kind of a decision, right? And then if it's owned by the city, well then it's a matter of kind of coming to terms with the city, with some type of development agreement, right? If it's a site that's owned privately, then the developers are going to have to reach out to the owners of that property and negotiate a contract. And so, hopefully the owner of that property is open to selling that property, right? And as long as we have that site control by the end of 2019, which would be a purchase agreement or a lease, we could submit that in the app in January, basically. So, does that make sense, or was I kind of?
The site control needs to be done by the July prior to.
Well, we wouldn't be submitting until actually like February of 2020. So, because I think at this point the sites are still up in the air, or kind of exactly what direction, how the city's going or the village is going to do things, right? So I would say right now, let's look at sites, let's see what works best, what scores best, make recommendations, identify a site, make recommendations, and then kind of move forward with that site, whether it's city-owned or privately owned. And then it's kind of up to the developer to kind of negotiate with his, privately owned. But you don't really need that till right before the application. So I'm saying the end of 2019, but really the application isn't due till like February of 2020. So you kind of wait till the last minute if you wait till February. But yeah, you'd like to have it. You'd like to know that you are going to have it under site control, and it's got to be under site control through July, the end of July, and there can't be any conditions for the seller to get out. Like Chris was saying, where they could entertain somebody else coming in with a better offer or something. They can't do that. So,
I also want to say that because the Housing Authority wears two hats in this matter. We serve as to help and consult and advise communities. We are also a developer ourselves. And in all fairness, I want to introduce someone, Melissa Babcock. If you come up for a minute, if you would, please. She represents Steve Crozier, who is a developer also. Okay. And who has done work here. Latiera is one of his.
Okay.
Okay. So to be fair, and it is a competitive process with the developer too. I would want to introduce our competition.
Okay.
So,
Well, welcome. Tell us your name again.
Melissa Babcock,
Melissa Babcock, okay.
and I work with Steve Crozier, who, like you said, has done Latier.
So let me say this, I'm not sure that most of the people in here know that Latier is a very similar project, or it's
Right.
under the same guideline. Because I think a lot of people know Latier where it is, and because it's located in White Mountain and everything. That here's a project that you can go look at that and you can see that's the type of project we're looking at building. So
Right.
I think that's important for you all to understand that. So, because if you haven't seen Latier, I encourage you to go drive up there and see it. It's off of L.L. Davis, no, off of
Jack Little.
Jack
Yeah.
Little.
And I was talking to someone, that property is 17 years old. And there is a resident that lives there that 17 years ago, 18, 19, when we were in the development stages of it, had similar to what we're having right now, where people are curious what it's about, they don't know. And he said, all these years later, I'm a little embarrassed, I didn't know, I was hesitant, it was the not in my neighborhood sort of reaction. And he said, and 17 years later, I can say, you guys have been great neighbors. And there's just some misconception, and I don't think that's what this meeting is probably about, but I've been in the business for 18 years. There's never been a city that we built in that there hasn't been some misconception and some fear of what it really means to have affordable housing. What that, means. It's evolved greatly over 18 years, well, many years. But anyways, so I'm open if anyone wants to pick my brain on what that really means. People say right away, oh, there goes my property values, and those are some real issues that residents have when we want to come into your city, our city, and build. And so, anyways, so for us, we've been here for 17 years. Our company has 15 apartment complexes in New Mexico. We only do New Mexico. And so, yeah.
So are you interested in being the potential?
We are.
Okay, good. That's good.
Very early stages of that, but yes.
Yeah, well, we thought we were farther along, but we're not anymore.
Right.
So
And
you're right along with us.
Right, I got this information that I thought we were gonna try to submit this year, which I was thinking, wow, I don't think we would make it, but,
Well, and I know I can speak for Crozier, and I can speak for all the builders. Many of the issues with the development in regards to community input into design and appearance, how those, all developers operate the same way. They want those units to be a part of and fit integrally into that community. And so, no matter whether we are the developers, or the developers, or yes, or any of the other developers, they're all going to be willing to go along with those same community involvement. They want community input, and so those concerns, no matter who the developer is they're going to go along with that. Because that's just, they're going to have their architects down, or whoever they're working on so that those appearance and how that fits in your community, has a lot of community.
well, and that's part of the scoring criteria, or at least it was. I think that's gonna change, but, they have approval on the design that you have, so that you're not coming into cities and sort of having, we don't wanna stand out, we wanna fit in, and we wanna make it modern, and that's the whole concept of affordable housing is, and I think some of the misconception is, that people are gonna pay no rent. That's probably the biggest, even today, people walk in lots here and say, well, I have no money, and so therefore my rent would be zero. And you say there's other programs for people who have no money, but this particular program doesn't work that way, and people would be surprised to know that some rent is low ball is $500 and the high end is $800. Well, while $800 is cheaper than, or is expensive, it still is cheaper than what you can rent a house, and that's the concept, is to be competitive, but to allow people to live, not have to do what used to be called the projects years ago, and that was the whole invention of affordable housing, was that what they found in studies was you had generation after generation after generation living in, again, what was called, HUD housing or whatever. And so people weren't trying to better themselves. And so I always call this sort of the middle ground housing, where it, encourages you. And it's evolved. Now there's programs that we do in the scoring criteria where we say, we're not just gonna build housing and walk away. There's things that we do. We offer financial training classes, we build daycares, we do medical, we have nurses that come in and do blood pressure checks, and the list is long, it's just a long list of services that we do. My favorite is the financial training, because while we want to keep residents, it's the middle ground, and we even give one part of it. I'm not saying that that's in every application, but in some of the ones that we've done, we even have a separate account that puts funds in it to help people one day buy their own home. So it's, it really is a great program, and I just think people don't know really what it entails. So.
Great.
So going back to what was invited, so I think that the key for the discussion is I would say, try to determine if the property's listed, what the city has available, what the private citizens have offered, if they're available. That's these sites have to be actually truly available for purchase. And then if we can maybe winnow that down to 3 or 4, and then we can do full assessments on how that might score. Because that's going to be important for, because if it's not competitive, there's no sense in.
You guys have any questions?
Does the village have these funds available to buy these properties if they?
No, sir, we do not. So the village was looking at village-owned property when we began this process after completing the affordable housing plan. So this is a general fund expense, and by state law under the Affordable Housing Act and under the Affordable Housing Ordinance, we developed an affordable housing trust fund. So we put a little bit of money there. I think there's probably not more than $15,000 or $16,000 in it. But the properties that are listed on your agenda are properties that were submitted during this process of properties for consideration. So we met with Chris and Cesar earlier, and to try to secure those properties with village resources is going to be difficult.
So the way we can obtain these properties is to here, like trading some village-owned property?
You could trade property.
Other than that?
You might could develop a partnership. We talked earlier today about some potential partnerships that could happen.
And the reality is that the project could purchase it, but the issue with that is that, as in all things, you then still have the issue of leveraging the local contribution. Still, that's still the different points. And then in addition, as you add costs to the project, this increases the cost of the project and makes it harder to finance.
So, from a local, what are examples? So let's say we don't have village property to put into. What are examples of local contributions? So sounds like we only got $15,000 to me. So
That's what's in the fund today.
I hear that, but let's go with that. Okay.
Well, so the local contribution, we recently did a small workforce project in Eunice where we had the city did donate the land, but also the county came in with $1 million on that project as well. So that's local contribution. In the vast majority of tax credit cases, it's usually property. It's usually where the local contribution occurs. I would say, it's either unless.
I mean, it's property, it's money. I mean, our Rosemont project, Artesia, City of Artesia provided $1.3 million. If you look at Albuquerque, their workforce monies, yeah, they provide over $1 million to the project. They have their ops, same thing. So it's a 60-unit project. That's what we're looking at, and maybe that's around $14 million. So to maximize the scoring, you want to have 10% leverage. So you're looking at 1.3, 1.4 mil in contribution locally, and also if there's any private money that can come into the project, they allow that now too. So it's sizable, and I was just going to say that's what makes projects competitive. That's why House was getting all these projects. That's why Albuquerque gets these projects. That's one of the main reasons.
Mr. Chairman, members of the Housing Commission, I just wanted to bring up a few of the facts. I've spent a little bit of time looking over the housing study. I haven't completely informed myself on the housing study, but the housing study was conducted in 2015, and they looked at conditions at that time. And at that point in time, just on the affordable housing, at that point in time, they looked at 230 units that were needed. And then they did your projections with your growth, and it projected an additional 60, 70 units for a total of 305 units that are needed. That was at 2015. So you know, the project that's being proposed now, and the site that you're looking at is going to accommodate 60 of that. You know, you're still going to be behind over 245 units. So I think instead of just limiting it to starting to think about building one project, I think we really need to consider how we're going to establish a process of building these projects, partnering, and then, you know, eventually building out the total need for the community. And that's just in the rental area. Then you get into home ownership, and there's other aspects of it that you go into the assisted living and the need for the elderly community as well. So, you know, I don't think when we're thinking about this process, we should limit ourselves to just thinking about this project. I think you need to look at, think about the total need of the community.
Right, we started out really with that. I think our intent is to try to first, let's at least make a gift into the issues that we see. And then with that, let's get one thing underneath our belt and we can move on to the others. But that was, we were looking at a little short time frame than we are now, so I think that's what we're doing.
You know, what I'm saying is we may be looking at multiple properties and not just one. And the ones that are most competitive, because this is a competitive process, is, you know, really what needs to be put up. Because if not, if you're not competitive, there's other projects throughout the state that, you know, are going to be going after these same dollars. And we really need to make an effort as a community to put in our best application.
There's usually about 3 or 4 applications for every award in most years.
For every what?
For every award.
For-
Yeah, usually there's, this last year we had fewer because there was a fairly significant change to the QAP this last year. But in most of the prior years, we had between 20 and 25 applications for between 4 and 5 awards. So it's got a 20% chance of getting it.
Mr. Chairman, one thing I wanted to add, you know, I would encourage people to take advantage of the opportunity to go on the tour and see the properties. I've actually, you know, had the pleasure in one of my previous positions to go up to Santa Fe and view the Santa Fe Civic properties. And they're, you know, within 2 blocks away from Santa Fe, downtown Plaza in Santa Fe, and people don't even know that they're there. They fit right into the neighborhood, and you know, they're really nice projects.
Well, and I know Melissa's willing to have folks come to La Tierra and just view the property. We've offered to have people go down again to Roselawn and take people on a tour and buy folks lunch and those kind of things to look at. So, and that's for community members and for the board and anybody who's interested. Just so that you can have a good look at what tax credit projects are. So.
Mr. Chairman, if I might add to this point, what was really important to me when I went on the tour was to see the brand new one in Artesia and then to see the one in Roswell that was 20 years old.
Right.
Because one of the concerns is, you know, are they going to be maintained, are they going to dilapidate, are they going to devalue the property? And I know in conversations with Christian Cesar, the statistics show that it actually provides value to the area, property values are increased. But what I was most impressed with was the one in Roswell. Just because 20 years later, it's beautiful. It's very, very well maintained. It's landscape, the inside, the interior is incredibly nice. So could you talk a little bit, Chris, about the process of how once the properties are built, then they're contracted for overall day-to-day business and operation?
A part of what the tax credit program requires is that you have a property management company lined out as part of your applications. And those have to be pre-approved by the MFA. And there's a number of purposes for that. There's sustainability and make sure the project is viable long-term. The other part of it is the tax credit project is extremely complex. And making sure that those people qualify on their first, as they come into those units and as those units lease up, is extraordinarily important in the way that those tax credits are afforded to the investors who are paying the $10 to $14 million to have this property built. And if that's not done properly, the IRS recaptures those tax credits, and those investors are extraordinarily unhappy. So you have to have professional management companies, and that's why tax credits look as good as they do, because you've got professional management companies that know what they're doing, operating those in the long term, for not 5 years or 10 years, but you're talking about 20 years, people are running. And Melissa's group is one of those groups that operates these long-term monitoring, is the property that's managing the property in Artesia. So you, and that list is not extraordinarily long, there's only about 5 or 6 of those groups in state that MFA will approve. And that's because you have to have a track record of being able to, number one, keep the property viable long-term, and also then operate the tax credit program properly. So, does that answer the question?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Sitting here as a board member, some of your comments arouse a bit of apprehension in myself. And part of what this group will do will be to forward recommendations to village council. Those decisions that we make, those recommendations that we put forward really and truly need to be designed and headed in the direction of creating the best application possible for these grant funds. Not knowing what the criteria are for the grant funds, not knowing what that scorecard is, I would like to request a copy of those criteria as we move forward, that I and my peers might be better informed on the decisions we make. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Dr. Allen, we provided that criteria, but we're happy to provide it again.
Okay.
And it's in a packet, and we'll just duplicate that packet, because I think that's really important. As you look at these sites, or Mr. Chairman, you might want to assign a couple people or the whole board, however you want to do it, to look at the village-owned property and this property, and then see the criteria, work with Cesar and Chris to kind of come up with your top 2 or 3 or 4 sites. And then you're right, that you need to pick sites not because it's flat and it's pretty, but because it's going to meet the criteria to score the points to be eligible for.
Thank you.
And if it pleases the board, maybe what we could do is pick one, just choose one, and then Cesar and I can come up and sit down with you, and we can walk through the criteria with you and show you how that would be scored, or how we would estimate that would be scored.
Well, maybe we can do that on the village-owned property first, and then from there, we can, since we know that one,
We can do that.
we can do that as a team, and then we as a.
Well, and then that gives you the
we can look
ability
at the
to
others.
know what
Right.
the criteria are and what we're looking at as we do scoring assessments. So,
We get in trouble for walking around somebody else's property, right?
yeah, we probably did.
I do think it's important as a committee, so, you know, we do have these pieces of property that I think we need to look at consideration and offer. And then, so I think maybe learning the scoring technique would be very important to do, but I think over the next month, if we can, I think it would be nice for us to look at these other properties that are listed here, and do a similar thing, at least an assessment for us, so we can, I mean, I know some of these properties, but there's some on here I definitely don't have a clue about, and so, I can't speak to them.
I have a hard time visualizing 60 units on 2 acres. I mean, that's a lot unless you're going to go top, which would destroy basically the landscape here. But I also understand that the farther out you go, that of course could limit us on the criteria. So, you know, I try.
Yeah, there's a lot of balancing that has to be done in those kind of things, so.
Well, just remember, the village has a limitation, I don't remember what it is on the height and how high you can build anyway, so I think that the proposal is that the Hotel Ruidoso, we wouldn't be even up half of the height of that, as far as that, so this building would be, at least what I've heard, would be about half the height of that building, so you're not disturbing at least in that area, from a visual standpoint, so.
But that's also important as a part of the design concept, as the community is designed. Make sure that that is a part of its height and how it fits in to the mountain and how it's viewed is important. So that's something to keep pushing that, because you always want your architects for whichever design you're doing, keep that in mind, so.
And if we're going to attract younger families, we need to have green space too. And I have friends at La Tierra, which is a beautiful complex. And how many acres is there, Melissa?
I think that's a little shy of 5 acres, if I
So,
remember.
which is a nice little area there. And of course, you have to take into account a playground,
Different for a family. complex.
parking, all that
Absolutely.
stuff, yeah. So 16.
Yeah. But 5 acres is pretty average for 60 units, right? I mean, you could,
How many units is it, lot here?
60.
60.
Well, 5 acres is ideal. If you have 5 or 6 acres, I mean, you're 10 units. 10 acres. I mean, I think Midtown is 3.5 acres. So, I mean, it's tight. So architects will have to kind of go to work to see kind of how they could fit things. And the state MFA does have their requirements for amenities, open space, clubhouse space for the property, gardens, green space. So all of that would have to be met too.
Is that 5 acre footprint, plenty of parking as well?
Oh, yeah, typically, I mean, a density of 10 units per acre isn't very dense, so, but, I mean, if we could find a site like that, yeah, that would give us more room, definitely give us more room. You know, it just, sometimes it doesn't always work that way, right?
And being on the public transportation committee, and having looked this past Tuesday on where the bus transportation is hopefully going to go, it has to be easily accessible to public transportation.
Yes, it has to be accessible. That's one of the scoring criteria. Or else we'll have to, if there isn't public transit, we have to provide some other alternative to get those points.
Anything else we think? Board comments in general?
No, yeah, all my answer.
Chavez Road will be a really tough one because there's no sewer infrastructure or anything there, and it is so far removed from the main roads, I don't see any public transportation making it to that, even though it has an incredible acreage.
I noticed where it was on the map. It's up there a little bit.
Right, sewer's not going there anytime soon that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Or is it anywhere close to that area?
Here's a. That's, what's in green is what's Village owned.
It's up here. It's up here. How much upward? Okay, yeah, right here. So that's bullshit. See, that's all horizontal.
Yeah.
It's somewhere right in
Yeah,
here.
somewhere there.
It's a big rock mountain. That's why there's no sewer out there.
So, Mr. Chairman, do you want to set your next meeting to schedule Chris and Caesar to walk you through the criteria
Yeah, I think-
of one of the properties?
Well, we could do that. That would be easier for us if we just did it during the meeting. Maybe we'll just make a meeting at a site to do that. You guys okay with that? Okay, what's better than that? I like that. That's a great idea. Yeah. Hopefully that works for y'all. The only comment I would say is, and it's funny because I told my sister-in-law is a resident over in an area near the property that the village owns. And I told her at the time when I first, after I'd gone to Artesian, went to, Roswell, that I wouldn't care if these were built in my neighborhood. I can now say they're ones built in my neighborhood, so just so y'all know that I live in White Mountain, so I do have that advantage. It's actually just, it's about 2 blocks away from my house, if you know the truth. So I can actually say that, because I did say at the time it didn't matter if it was built there, it is built there, so I do have that to say, so. Public comment, I don't know if there's anyone who wishes to have public comment, so we'll limit that to 5 minutes if anybody wants to speak.
Can you ask your question?
Yes, sir. You mind stating your name, just so we,
Rick Albers.
okay?
Couple things I couldn't quite hear was the percentage of the contribution from the village and how that affects the scoring, and then the density.
Okay, on the scoring, basically you can get from 1 to 10 points, and it's based upon the percentage of the contribution to the project relative to the development cost. So if the project is $10 million, if you provide 10%, you would have to provide like $1 million to get the 10 points. But it can be less down to that.
But that affects your score.
Yeah, right, right.
Okay.
And then on density, really, that's based upon kind of local government and what their zoning and development standards are, and what can be done. So it's not, we can't come into, or a developer can't come into an area and say, I'm gonna do this, and we have to pay attention to the code.
I guess what I was trying to understand is whether or not there was an ideal density that would raise or lower your score.
No.
Okay.
It all depends, it doesn't affect that, and, it all depends where your project is, right? So, typically if you're in more rural areas, there's more land, right? But if you're in urban areas, that it tightens up. There's not a lot of 5-acre sites in Albuquerque, right? In downtown or in that area, so. And then, again, it goes back to the code. What can you build on the site? What's the zoning? What's allowed? We cannot submit an application on a site where the zoning prohibits multifamily. So that's their criteria. So it has to be allowed in some way.
Do you have a chart that has what these percentages are?
I can get you a copy of the criteria, the scoring
I
criteria.
think that would be helpful to.
Okay.
If you're interested, Matt, please attend the next meeting, and we'll be going over those criteria and show the points and how those score out.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I know at our last meeting, we had numerous people got up and talked about the infrastructure, the issues of that area, sewer, water, traffic, and so forth. I mean, do y'all look at that? Because, that's a very tight area with very poor infrastructure. I live very close to there. And I can't tell you how many times the road gets dug up fixing water leaks. And, to put a 70-unit complex like this right there with the infrastructure that's there just makes no sense to me whatsoever. Yeah.
From a developer standpoint, I think Crozier would say the same thing, that infrastructure issue would be something we would refer back to the city and ask the village to talk with us about whether that works or whether that doesn't work, or whether they would plan on the usage of that and how that would work.
I know.
There's got to be capacity, right?
Yeah, I just know residents up, I live about a quarter of a mile from there, and many residents have expressed that concern about the infrastructure. It's in bad shape right now, and you put 70 units, let's say 70 units there, and it's not gonna get any better. Like I said, I've got backhoes going up and down my street, digging holes all the time. On K Street, yesterday I was trying to go through, I couldn't even get through because they were digging up the street. And Grant Street right above me, there's holes all the way up and down that street.
So
Side streets, yeah.
So my understanding in talking to Bradford was that there was capacity that was taken care of. But that's something that,
Well, so let me say this, because I think that's something that we would need to have the village provide us an assessment of to make that determination. I mean, I'm going through that with the hospital right now, and the infrastructure has not been ideal over the time. The village, I think most cities I've lived in, I can tell you, they would tell you the same thing. It always seems that there's one person that knows where every shut-off valve is, and if he dies, we're all in trouble. I know. I can tell you that's been the situation everyone's, but at the same time, I think what we should do, I think your point is very valid. I think the traffic and the infrastructure is especially after we heard the last time about.
There's people running into each other all the time over there. Chase Street, where Wingfield comes in, is very poorly marked. I mean, you're almost right on the stop sign before you see it.
Yeah.
I had somebody going to a meeting the
I
other
think
day, almost
if
that's where
that
run into
were,
me.
if that were the property that we ended up selecting, that would be something that we would have to require the developer to do something to address both the traffic issues and also the infrastructure issues. I think that's a, we know that, at least I know that, so I can speak for myself.
So-
Yes, sir.
Todd, could I just speak to that real quickly? And I won't go into a lot of detail, but we're ready to speak to that at the right time. But
Okay.
there is a sewer, it's called a PER, preliminary engineering report, that's looked at all the sewer throughout the entire city. There is a plan on how to address the problem this village has is that it's old and all the infrastructure in the ground is in really bad shape. We're so grateful to the citizens because 3 elections now you voted to allow us to replace water lines, because at one time we were having an average of 5 breaks a day, and now we're averaging maybe 5 a week, but the infrastructure is bad. But we do have that area assessed. We also have met whether we build the property, the apartments there or the complex there, the housing units there or not. We have already met with DOT, and we have real issue with that traffic problem there at Chase Street, and so that's gonna get addressed no matter what. But
It's a very narrow road.
and it's
Very
surprising
narrow
that
road.
people don't get killed there, get accidents
Yeah.
more often.
One of my neighbors
It's a
ran
true
into a
problem.
dumpster. So he ran into a dumpster, and, you know, that's how tight it is there.
Yes,
So
sir.
no
The
matter what, we're
dumpsters are
gonna,
right on the road.
yeah, we're gonna address that. But all of those things, we actually have things in motion. The reality is it's gonna take time and resources, and so we've identified what that timeline is and how we're gonna fund it, but it's not gonna happen overnight. So you would just need to know on the sites you select, you know, what is the existing infrastructure, what's the condition of it, is there capacity, what would it take to improve it or
Right, I think
to
that's. what we
support
would do.
whatever development that occurs. So I think that's an appropriate question.
Yeah.
Thank you, all of you, on the advisory board. We appreciate that this has been slowed down a bit, and it sounds like discussions are now to the place where we can accomplish this. There is not a great opposition to the concept of affordable housing or low-income housing. We have great examples here. The competitors are here. So thank you. We appreciate all of you. I mean, that's why the room's not so full, because you've helped slow it, and you guys are asking very thoughtful questions and good questions, because we can accomplish this. And I was going to ask this fellow here, that rule of thumb, you said is approximately 10 units per acre. Is that the ideal development? And if so, is there also a minimum of the 60? Is the 60 unit a minimum to attract the investors to meet this $10 to $14 million investment? Is that what the magic number is, economics? I mean, does it have to be a 60 unit project, and is it, and if so?
Right. The economics of a 60 to 70 unit project work best. The smaller it is, the smaller it is to operate. Okay, and with the amount of money that we get from the state to do a project, we can't really, the larger your project, the better the economies, but we really only get funding for like the biggest project we could do is maybe 60 to 70. And so it's just more viable financially to make it or have it in that range. Okay.
So thank you. So that's going to help clarify our scoring ability. If this particular property that's been kind of controversial in that neighborhood, it's really not an opposition, the philosophical opposition of whether affordable housing is needed or not. It's that location. And I've just heard it's like 3.5 acres, is that's what's usable. So if you did your formula of 10 units per acre, you'd really only be able to satisfy 30 units there. So would that take the scoring away immediately? Would that disqualify that piece of land? Or should we look at other pieces where we want to get 6 acres at the 10
So there's not really I'm sorry, so there really isn't a criteria that talks about or related to the amount of area and the amount of density. That's really, we want to be around that 60, 70 unit range because it's most viable. And it's really for the developer to go out and find a site where it works in the local jurisdiction. So I think based on the code here, I think we can fit that, or that's my understanding, when talking to Bradford. What that would look like, yes, I think it's going to be kind of tight. I think we could do 2-story there, but I would want like an argument, or give that program of how many units it is and bedroom sizes, and have an architect kind of lay it out and see what it looks like. And yeah, and yes, it is on the denser side. I mean, it is nice to have something that's bigger, that's 5 or 6 acres, because then you have more open space, then the density is less. But like I said, you don't always have that. And so, I mean, I think that's what we're trying to do right here. It's, okay, let's look at that site, but let's look at other sites and score them and see what makes sense, right?
Well, you mentioned too in the codes, these investors will want, or the project will want to meet the code criteria.
We have to.
And that particular property I know is not it's not zoned for a multi-use.
C2.
High density.
Yes, it is.
That's an allowable use in C2.
Exactly.
Because I understood that was for commercial development, but I was saying there's a 7 or a 4 C7 or something that is what, but I'm not gonna go into that one. Can I ask you about how many acres, the 5 acres, how many units are on your?
60.
There's 60 on that. So that would be a good example to help those of us who is concerned, you know, about what it's gonna look like and neighbors. So we appreciate you bringing that out also. And I'm familiar with that property that was mentioned on the agenda, the 6 acres, the $250,000. And as a realtor, I've walked that property, and I could see and visualize those 60 units fitting very well. There's also quite a bit of more newer infrastructure in that area. There's more water availability. There's also access to a 4-lane highway that's outside there that would help a lot. So I'm bringing this up to help my advisors here. Like Dr. Allred, your thought is so well taken that as you go to the council, it does make you uncomfortable. How much time are you guys going to spend with not knowing the criteria of what has to be met to even recommend a piece of land or location? And so, again, I'm still a little bit, I think I'm speaking for some of these other things, we very, kind of still a little suspicious that this is trying to be pushed on that particular property there at Chase Street. So there will be some resistance. So as your investors are looking at that, and as far as meeting the scoring, please, in a open-minded way, really consider these other pieces of property. Even though the village may not own them, and they only have $16,000 in this trust, there is still ways, because now we're looking at about a 24-month period instead of next February. If the village can use the general fund and begin to earmark properties, and to the village, they already spent $1 million on this one piece, and they were able to come up with that money. They could come up with $250,000 or be a shared investor. Here's all the infrastructure, you know, all these, like Chavez Street, mentioned the 12 acres. Maybe the village could get their grub stake into it by saying, we'll provide all the infrastructure up there. So the village will invest their $200,000, $500,000, whatever it takes to get infrastructure to that 12 acres. So I'm just kicking these ideas out for this advisory board, and thank you all for your input, and thanks for being so honest about HUD housing, low-income housing, and affordable housing.
So let me just say, we have to, the state does a market study. Whatever application is submitted, they do a market study to make sure that there is sufficient demand for that type of development. And then the developer, that's part of our due diligence. We got to make sure that there's a market for our project. Okay, so once you get an award, then all the investors are going to they're gonna start calling and saying, hey, I wanna do your project, I'm gonna offer you 90 cents on each tax credit or $1 or whatever it is. But as long as we have a market for it, the investor is okay. What ends up happening with these investors is if you're too rural or out of the way, or the project is too small, then the investors get a little bit skittish. But the village here, it's a solid market, so the investors aren't gonna have an issue.
Okay, that's what I was gonna re-correct you on that. This market is a very appealing market.
Yep.
And these folks here already know. They've invested in, and these properties, most of us are familiar with. Our community is not huge. We're a mountain town, and we have a lot of stuff everywhere. It's tucked into canyons, and back here and back there. So anywhere these homes or this affordable housing is put is going to be an ideal. It should score high. It's grocery stores and places to work.
Let me turn with this gentleman, he's been waiting for a while.
Yeah, I'd like to make 2 comments. La Tierra, I remember when that came up, I live around the corner from it and have for 20-some years. And the people that had the Pinon Park condominiums across the street were very opposed to it. You guys have done a beautiful job there. It's been maintained without question. I drive by there and it's a very attractive single-story units that I think is really important. The other thing that I will mention on the 6-acre tract over on 70, I sold that to this family that owns it for the whole 10 acres for $250,000. Now that was a lot of years ago, but they built a motel that's, I don't remember the name of it now, but the big motel on the corner. My personal opinion is that is, in terms of utilities, of access, of convenience, getting in and out of traffic, all those kind of things, is a beautiful location for it. And
Harvey, which location is that?
on Highway 70 down there by the castle.
Oh,
Yeah. There's 6 acres. Some of the land up in the back there is rather steep and not real buildable, but you've got a lot of good land in that front section to do whatever. So, it's just, and again, like anything else, these are asking prices, not necessarily sale prices. So.
Thank you.
I just wanted to address the comment about the board ignorance. I have to admit, I speak about my own ignorance only. And I would point to an example that Board Member Meek, seated beside me here, reminded me, oh yes, we got that, and it's an April document that we all received previously. I just didn't remember.
I was just gonna say, I think it's important for you all to see what the criteria is, because that's what a developer looks at. And so if it makes sense, we're gonna move forward. If not, we're gonna move to another site. And, the Midtown site, that's a prime piece of real estate, but let's look at all the sites, let's score them, let's see what makes sense. Yes, if we can get 5 acres, that's even